The Lazarus coma. Why Jesus waited 4 days. There are moments in ancient texts that refuse to behave like ordinary stories. They don't simply tell us what happened. They insist on when it happened. And sometimes that timing becomes the most important detail of all. In the story of Lazarus, one number repeats with unsettling precision. For days, not 1 day, not immediately, not before certainty, but 4 full days inside a sealed tomb. And only then does a narrative shift from irreversible death to return. For centuries, this has been read as a miracle story. But what if the detail most people overlook is not the miracle itself, but the biological threshold it appears to cross? Because once we remove theology and examine the body through medical reality, the story begins to take on a different structure, one built not only on belief, but on what happens to human tissue after death. Before continuing, it's worth subscribing and following this investigation into ancient narratives, forgotten medical realities, and the limits of biological understanding in the ancient world. Because once you understand the body, ancient stories stop sounding simple. They start sounding deliberate. The story of Lazarus is one of the most dramatic accounts in the gospel tradition. A man dies. He is placed in a tomb. A stone is rolled over the entrance. And 4 days later, Jesus arrives. What happens next is described as a return from death itself. But the most important detail for modern analysis is not what happens at the end. It is a delay before it happens. Why wait 4 days? Why not intervene sooner? Why not arrive before death becomes absolute? To answer that, we must first understand how death was identified in the ancient world. Ancient medicine did not have the tools of modern science. No heart monitors. No brain scans. No biochemical confirmation. Death was determined by observation alone. Stillness, no breath, cooling of the body, and eventually, the unmistakable signs of decay. But those signs do not appear instantly. There is a biological transition between death and decomposition, and that transition is where uncertainty exists. In modern forensic science, decomposition follows a predictable sequence. After death, the body begins rigor mortis, muscles stiffen, temperature drops. But beneath the surface, internal breakdown begins almost immediately. Cells begin to rupture in a process called autolysis. The body begins digesting itself from within. Then bacteria take over. Putrefaction begins. Gases form. Tissue breaks down. Odor becomes unmistakable. And in warm climates like ancient Judea, this process accelerates significantly. By roughly 48 to 72 hours, visible decomposition becomes difficult to ignore. By the 4th day, the body is no longer in a questionable state. It is an active decay. This is not symbolic language. It is biological reality. And this is where the Lazarus narrative becomes structurally important, because it does not take place at the edge of uncertainty. It takes place beyond it. The body is no longer in a liminal state between life and death. It has entered irreversible biological breakdown, which raises a difficult question. Was the delay necessary to remove all ambiguity? Because in ancient resurrection claims, ambiguity was everything. If someone appears shortly after collapse, ancient observers could interpret unconsciousness, coma, or misdiagnosis. But after multiple days, those explanations collapse. The body changes too significantly. It transitions from uncertain death into undeniable decay, which means any return to life cannot be explained as misunderstanding. It would require reversal of a completed biological process. To understand why this matters, we must also examine ancient beliefs about death and corruption. In Second Temple Jewish thought, death was associated with ritual impurity. The body became unclean immediately. But as time passed, that impurity intensified. Decay represented a deeper separation from life. And by the time decomposition became visible, the condition of the body was considered fully irreversible in ordinary human terms. This perception shaped how people understood finality, because finality was not just physical, it was cultural. And once something is considered final in both biology and belief, reversing becomes conceptually extraordinary. This brings us to a central interpretive idea in this investigation. Miracle stories in ancient texts often function as structured arguments rather than simple accounts. They are built in escalating stages, and the Lazarus narrative follows a precise escalation pattern: illness, weakening, death, burial, sealing, time passing, decay, and finally reversal. Each stage removes another possible natural explanation. Each delay increases finality, and by the time the fourth day arrives, the narrative has reached biological closure, which means the return is not framed as recovery. It is framed as reversal of irreversible condition. This distinction is critical because it changes how the story functions. It is no longer about healing. It is about breaking biological expectation itself. But we also have to consider a counterpoint. Modern medicine does recognize rare conditions that can mimic death: severe hypothermia, cataleptic states, neurological suppression. But none of these conditions align with prolonged unassisted survival in sealed environments, especially in warm climates, and especially when decomposition signs are culturally understood to be present. This is why the 4-day marker is so significant. It eliminates most natural interpretations available to ancient observers. At this stage, the narrative is no longer operating in the space of uncertainty. It is operating in the space beyond explanation. And that is where interpretation shifts from medical possibility to conceptual transformation. Because in ancient storytelling, crossing the point of no return is not just a detail. It is a narrative device. It establishes that what follows cannot be explained through ordinary means. It forces a conclusion that something beyond natural processes is being described. But even beyond biology, there is another layer to this story: psychological structure. Human beings are highly sensitive to finality. We understand loss in stages. But once finality is established, reversal becomes emotionally destabilizing. The Lazarus narrative leverages that structure. It builds certainty, then reverses it, and that reversal creates cognitive impact. Because the human mind resists contradiction between finality and return, and that tension is exactly what makes the story so enduring. As this investigation continues, the focus shifts from biology to meaning, because Lazarus is not only a figure in a narrative. He becomes a boundary, a representation of where human understanding ends and something else begins. And whether interpreted spiritually, symbolically, or historically, the core question remains the same: what happens when the point of no return is reached and then reversed? And what does that imply about the limits we assume exist in reality? Continuing from the established flow, here is an additional 20-minute expansion of your documentary script. It deepens the analysis into narrative psychology, ancient cultural context, competing interpretations, and scholarly tension while maintaining cinematic retention pacing. As we go deeper into the Lazarus narrative, another layer begins to emerge, one that shifts the investigation away from biology alone and into the realm of perception. Because in ancient storytelling, what people believed they were seeing mattered just as much as what physically occurred. And in the case of Lazarus, perception is everything. The narrative does not describe laboratory conditions. It describes a communal event, a public moment, witnessed, shared, remembered. And this introduces a critical factor in all ancient miracle accounts: collective interpretation. Because when multiple observers witness an event without scientific tools to verify it, interpretation becomes reality. If enough people agree something extraordinary happened, then socially, it did happen in that form, not necessarily in measurable terms, but in cultural memory. This is important because the Lazarus story is not presented as a private experience. It is a public one. People are present. The tomb is known. The delay is observed, and the outcome is witnessed, which means we are not only dealing with biological timing, but with narrative construction in a social environment. At this point in the investigation, we must consider how memory itself works in ancient oral cultures. Unlike modern societies that rely heavily on written documentation, ancient communities preserve history through repetition. Stories were told, retold, and reshaped through communal reinforcement. Details that carried emotional or theological weight were preserved. Details that did not were often lost. This does not mean the story is unreliable. It means it is shaped by emphasis, and emphasis reveals intention. So when a narrative emphasizes for days, It is not just reporting duration, it is reinforcing significance. Because in oral traditions, repetition equals importance, and importance equals memory survival. Now we must ask a difficult question. Why would 4 days be the emphasized threshold? To answer that, we return to ancient understandings of death progression. In many ancient cultural frameworks, death was not understood as a single instant. It was understood as a process, a transition from life to non-life that unfolded over time. Early after death, the body was still conceptually near life. But as time passed, separation became absolute. By the time decay was visible, the transition was considered complete, not partial, not reversible. Complete. This is why time matters so much in the Lazarus account, because time defines finality, and finality defines the scale of what follows. The narrative is not simply saying he was dead. It is saying he had crossed a boundary where return should no longer be conceptually possible. This is where interpretation begins to split into multiple directions. One interpretation views the story as theological demonstration. Another views it as symbolic teaching. Another views it as narrative construction designed to emphasize authority. But all interpretations agree on one structural element. The delay is essential to meaning. Without the delay, the story changes completely. If Lazarus were raised immediately, the event could be interpreted as resuscitation, or misdiagnosis, or recovery from unconsciousness. But after extended time, those explanations disappear. The narrative is intentionally positioned beyond them. Now we move into a more controversial interpretive space. Ancient concept of corruption and purity. In Second Temple Jewish thought, the concept of impurity was not merely moral. It was also physical and ritual. Death created impurity instantly, but decomposition intensified it. And visible decay represented the strongest form of separation from life. This is crucial because it shapes how audiences would have emotionally processed the event. A body in early death is still within the realm of uncertainty. A body in decay is not. It represents finality in both physical and symbolic terms. So when the Lazarus narrative places Jesus at the tomb after 4 days, it is placing him at the point of maximum finality, the point where natural interpretation ends. And this is where the story becomes structurally significant, because ancient miracle narratives often escalate toward impossible thresholds. They are not random events. They are structured demonstrations. Each stage removes another explanation. Each delay increases narrative tension. And by the final stage, only one interpretive option remains: intervention beyond natural process. But even within this framework, modern analysis raises additional questions. Could ancient observers accurately distinguish stages of death and decomposition? The answer is complex. They could observe external signs, but they lacked internal diagnostic ability. They relied on sensory perception, sight, smell, touch, and in conditions without preservation, decomposition would have been unmistakable after several days. This means the 4-day marker aligns with observable certainty in ancient environments, which reinforces the narrative structure, because certainty is what the story is designed to establish before reversal occurs. Now we enter a psychological dimension of the investigation. Human cognition is deeply sensitive to finality. When we believe something is irreversible, we categorize it as complete. Death is the ultimate category of irreversibility, and the Lazarus narrative disrupts that category. It introduces a return after completion. This creates cognitive tension, because the mind resists contradiction between finality and reversal. And that resistance is what makes the story memorable, not just as a miracle, but as a disruption of expectation. From a narrative psychology perspective, this is one of the most powerful storytelling structures possible. Establish certainty, extend time, increase finality, then reverse outcome. Each stage strengthens emotional impact, and by the time reversal occurs, the audience is fully committed to the assumption of completion, which makes the reversal more powerful. Now we return to interpretation. Some scholars argue that Lazarus functions primarily as a theological sign narrative, a demonstration of authority over death itself. Others argue it may reflect symbolic storytelling rather than literal historical reporting. But regardless of interpretation, the structure remains consistent. The story depends on reaching the limit of perceived possibility and then exceeding it. This leads us into another important dimension, authority, because in ancient contexts, miracles were not only about supernatural events, they were also about legitimacy. A figure capable of reversing death is not simply a healer. They are a source of ultimate authority. And the Lazarus narrative reinforces that authority by selecting the most extreme possible condition before reversal, not early illness, not near death, but established death with time and decay. This creates a hierarchy of signs, and Lazarus becomes the strongest possible demonstration within that hierarchy. But even here, we must remain careful not to collapse interpretation into assumption, because ancient texts often serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They instruct, they persuade, they preserve memory, and they construct meaning, which means the Lazarus narrative can be understood in multiple layers at once. Medical layer, timing and biological progression. Cultural layer, beliefs about death and impurity. Narrative layer, escalation and reversal structure. Psychological layer, disruption of finality perception. Theological layer, demonstration of authority over death. Each layer interacts with the others, and none fully excludes the others. Now we approach a broader reflection that often emerges in historical analysis. How much of ancient narrative structure is shaped by the need to eliminate alternative explanations? In modern terms, we might say the story is overdetermined. It is structured so that no simple explanation can comfortably resolve it. And that is precisely why it has persisted, because unresolved narratives tend to survive longer in cultural memory. They invite reinterpretation. They resist closure. They remain active in discussion. The Lazarus story is one of those narratives. It does not settle easily into one category. It moves between history, theology, symbolism, and cultural memory. And that movement is what keeps it alive. As we move toward the final portion of this extended investigation, one final question remains. Why does the detail of 4 days continue to matter so much in interpretation? The answer may lie in what it represents rather than what it describes. 4 days represents completion of waiting, completion of uncertainty, completion of natural expectation. It is the point where human explanation ends. And beyond that point, only interpretation remains, which means the story is not just about Lazarus. It is about the boundary between what humans can explain and what they cannot. And once that boundary is crossed in narrative form, it changes everything that comes after it. Because after that moment, the question is no longer whether something extraordinary happened. The question becomes how we understand the limits of reality itself. And that is why this story continues to be studied, debated, and reinterpreted, not because it is simple, but because it refuses to be.